welcome back to SMB Designs. This week we are beginning in the book of Exodus. So we are going to go over the cultural background here, and I will have your first question for the next drawing. So let me grab that real quick out of here and pick us a random card. All right. And the first question is, what was Solomon's other name? Interesting. What was Solomon's other name? Okay, leave your answers below, and we will continue to do as we did for the last book, where each week there's a question. You answer, each question you answer gets you an extra entry into the giveaway at the end. And I need to mention this, it does not matter if you have already won something or not. It's all based on participation. So if you're participating, you're in the entry. It doesn't matter if I've sent you something or not. So please join us in that and leave any questions or comments you have about the reading in the comments below. Also, if you would like, subscribe and share this video, comment. It really does help the algorithm to go ahead and get us into more people's suggested feed. So that way we can get the word of God out to more people. That would be amazing. And it's an easy way for you to support the channel. And with that said, we'll go ahead and jump in. And the book of Exodus contains narratives that became foundational for the belief system of ancient Israel. It is the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt that formed the basis for their relationship with God. It is the series of events at Mount Sinai and the establishment of the covenant there that later biblical texts refer back to time and again. The specific ideas and the theological message of this book played an especially integral role in ancient Israel's identity and self-understanding. Okay, the historical setting. The historical setting for the book of Exodus is essentially unknown. The book describes events that led to the escape of the ancient Israelites from Egypt, but a specific time period during which events such as these might have taken place cannot be determined with certainty. Suggestions have been made, and some accord better with the available evidence than others. The book of Exodus, however, yields too little information to establish a precise and convincing historical framework. The best one can do is to ascertain a broad time period into which the text attempts to place its narrated events. Many scholars believe that the book of Exodus places the events it recounts in a time period that fits best within the second half of the second millennium BC. In Egypt, this period of time is known as the New Kingdom, from 1550 to 1069 BC, whereas in the Levant, it corresponds to the Late Bronze Age, 1550 to 1200 BC, though some extend the period to 1550. And the first part of the Iron Age, referred to as Iron I, 1200 to 1000 BC. While Semitic slaves have been in Egypt for some time, it was during the New Kingdom that their numbers increased significantly. Building projects, tombs, monuments, temples also grew until they reached unprecedented levels during the reign of Ramesses II. Thus, Egypt's control of Palestine its increasing numbers of Semitic slaves and its swiftly growing construction efforts combined to make the New Kingdom an attractive option as a backdrop for many of the narratives in the book of Exodus. Key concepts for the book of Exodus. The law is part of God's revelation of himself. Giving it is an act of grace. God's presence comes on his terms and in his time. Deliverance is God's business and his alone. You shall know that I am the Lord your God. Okay. Types of literature. The book of Exodus contains an array of literary forms. The grand saga describing the Israelites' miraculous escape from enslavement in Egypt may best be described as epic narrative. In addition to the 10 Commandments, the book contains a long list of legal provisions. Thus, the genre of law must be considered. The section concerning the construction of the tabernacle is an example of the ancient Near Eastern literary form used to describe the building of sacred shrines. There are also ritual instructions in the latter part of the book that lay out the elaborate ceremonies required to consecrate Aaron and his sons as priests. Other ancient Near Eastern societies utilize each of these literary forms as well. The nature of these forms or genres and how they were used must function as key elements in any background analysis of biblical text. Thus, literary considerations are at times equally important as are the historical and cultural aspects of the ancient world in shedding light on the text of Exodus. Okay, guys, what I just read to you was from the Cultural Backgrounds Study Bible, and I wanted to read to you what the introduction in the ESV Study Bible says. So the title, Exodus is the second of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which are referred to collectively as either Torah, parentheses, says law, instruction in Hebrew, or Pentateuch, and in parentheses, 5 volumes in Greek. The English title Exodus is taken from the Septuagint and the Greek noun exodos, a going out or departure, the major event of the first half of the book in which the Lord brings Israel out of Egypt. The Hebrew title, names, is taken from the first line of the text. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. All right, authorship. The authorship and composition of the book of Exodus cannot be taken in isolation from the rest of the Torah/Pentateuch. The shape of the book of Exodus bears this out as it opens with a list of names referring to characters and events narrated in the book of Genesis, and closes with an assembled tabernacle that is filled with the glory of the Lord. Without Israel having received full instructions for how they are to serve the Lord in it. For further discussion of these matters in relation to what have traditionally been referred to as the 5 books of Moses, see the introduction to the Pentateuch. Like most books of the Old Testament, Exodus does not explicitly refer to its authorship or composition as a book. However, its genre and content have traditionally led to the conclusion that it was written by Moses as an authoritative record, both of its events and of the covenant instruction that the Lord revealed through him. While the reasons for this assessment of Exodus includes the explicit reference to Moses either writing or being commanded to write, they are not exhausted by it. The genre of Exodus is typically understood to be historical narrative, since it presents the material as events, speeches, and covenant instructions that took place in Israel's history. As a narrative, the book of Exodus focuses on specific aspects of the history in order to emphasize certain points for its intended audience. And in parentheses, it says something that all narrative about historical events necessarily does, even if merely through what it selects as important. In parentheses, Exodus emphasizes throughout the book that Yahweh, meaning the Lord, has remembered his covenant with Israel, will bring them out of Egypt, and will instruct them on how to live as his people as he dwells in their midst. Integral to this emphasis is the way Exodus also shows that Yahweh has chosen to reveal his purposes, lead his people out of Egypt, and instruct them on how they are to live through Moses. Thus, while Moses probably did not write everything in the Pentateuch, and while there also appears, I apologize for that, is a phone call from my daughter. Let's see. Where were we? Exodus also shows that Yahweh has chosen to reveal his purposes, lead his people out of Egypt, and instruct them on how they are to live through Moses. Thus, while Moses probably did not write everything in the Pentateuch, and while there also appears to be language and references that have been updated for later readers, the book of Exodus is best read as recorded and composed primarily by Moses. The date and historical context. The date of Israel's exodus from Egypt is the primary chronological problem for Exodus. The book contains few clues to solve it, while the narrative refers to the cities that the people of Israel were building in Egypt. In parentheses, it says Pithom and Ramses. Ramesses, Raamses. And the length of their time in Egypt, and it says in parentheses 430 years. It does not include the names of any of the kings of Egypt to which it refers. Nor does the book of Genesis record the name of the Pharaoh who knew Joseph. The context of the book clearly indicates that the Exodus and its time of year are important for Israel's identity, since Israel's calendar was reoriented around the month in which they came out of Egypt. But Exodus refers to these events as if its hearers/readers were familiar with them, and thus selects and shapes the details of the account in accord with its communicative purpose. As indicated in the article on the date of the Exodus, some scholars, working from the figure of 480 years for the time since the Exodus to Solomon's 4th year, calculate a date of circa 1446 BC for Israel's departure from Egypt. Others, because Exodus 1:11 depicts Israel working on a city called Ramesses, argue that this point to the exodus occurring during the reign of Ramesses II in Egypt, possibly around the year 1260 BC. Whatever the date of the Exodus, the question is not necessarily about whether the numbers given in the Old Testament are reliable, but rather about trying to understand their function. According to the conventions by which an author in the ancient Near Eastern context would have used them, any attempt to determine the date of the Exodus necessarily includes the interpretation of both the references in the Old Testament and the relevant records and artifacts from surrounding nations in the ancient Near East. That is, because the Old Testament was first given in an ancient Near Eastern setting, the interpreter's first task is to understand, as much as possible, what an ancient Israelite would have thought the text meant. Scholars are not always sure that they can answer this question when it comes to details about dates and numbers. Fortunately, the message of Exodus is plain. Nevertheless, the geography of Egypt, Sinai, and the route of the Exodus is another important matter for the book of Exodus that involves a similar process of trying to identify the references in the narrative to the landscape and cities with what is known or has been discovered about their location in relation to the current landscape. For a possible route of the Exodus, see map, page 143. I'm going to flip to that so you can actually see the map. Right here. So the dotted red line shows the possible Exodus, and it goes from, it looks like in the city of Ramesses, it goes through to what they're calling Succoth, and then it travels around, and it has two different lines going to Mara. And then that leads down to Elam and continues on to Mount Sinai, down the Red Sea. The theme. The overarching theme of Exodus is the fulfillment of God's promises to the patriarchs that he would make their descendants a great nation. This is carried out despite the opposition of the greatest superpower in the ancient world of the time, Egypt, and despite the unbelief and disobedience of the people themselves. Exodus shows that the success of the Exodus must be ascribed first to the power and character of God, who remembers his promises, punishes sin, and forgives the penitent. Second, it highlights both the faithfulness of Moses, who follows divine instructions exactly, and his prayerfulness. It is his prayer that leads to victory over Amalek, and his intercession that persuades God to pardon the people after they had begun worshiping the golden calf. What's the purpose, occasion, and background? Exodus is the second book in the Pentateuch and picks up the narrative of Genesis by focusing on the time when the sons of Jacob have grown into the people of Israel. The first half of the book records events that fulfill the promises to Abraham that his descendants would sojourn in a land that was not their own, be afflicted for 400 years, and then come out by the Lord's hand with numerous possessions. The narrative of Israel's preservation in and exodus out of Egypt is sometimes referred to as being like a second creation account, both because the vocabulary seems to evoke the first chapters of Genesis and because it is through Abraham's descendants that the Lord has promised to bless all nations and thus to restore his presence and purpose in the world. The second half of the book narrates the events surrounding the covenant being revealed, confirmed, broken, and renewed, and records the covenant instructions that the Lord revealed to Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai. The instructions begin with the 10 Commandments and include a lengthy section detailing the specifics for the construction of the tabernacle and its service. But this is not the totality of the Lord's covenant instructions, which are recorded further in both Leviticus and Numbers before Israel finally leaves the region of Mount Sinai for the land of Canaan. Numbers describe how the generation who came out of Egypt ended up wandering in the wilderness instead of entering Canaan. Then the book of Deuteronomy records Moses' reaffirmation of the covenant instructions recorded in Exodus through Numbers and appeals to the next generation who will enter the land to keep the commandments by fearing the Lord and walking in his ways. All right, the historical reliability of the Exodus. Doubts have often been cast on the historical reliability of the Exodus account. It is true that no remains of the Israelites have been found in the area of Goshen in the eastern Nile Delta or in the wilderness of Sinai. But in neither area would such remains be expected to survive. The mud-built huts of the Israelites have long been destroyed by repeated flooding and wandering through the wilderness. The people would not have left buildings or other permanent traces. It thus is unreasonable to expect such archaeological evidence. Furthermore, one should not expect to find extra-biblical texts regarding Israel's stay and departure from Egypt because the story is negative about Egypt. Egyptian texts are quite propagandistic and would not mention such a defeat. Nevertheless, there is plenty of data that seems to corroborate the biblical account. 1. It is most unlikely that a nation should invent a story of its origins as slaves in a neighboring country. 2. The second millennium BC was an era when there were many foreigners in Egypt, some of whom were employed making bricks for building projects. 3. The name of the city Ramesses is unlikely to have originated or have been remembered later. 4. Some have argued that the sequence of plagues related in Exodus fits with the ecological situation that accompanies and follows the annual flooding of the Nile. This need not imply that the plagues were purely natural. 5. The organization of the covenant texts in the Pentateuch fits the pattern of second millennium BC treaties, not later ones. 6. The tent tabernacle has many parallels in Egypt and Canaan from the second millennium. Indeed, traces of a tent shrine dating from about 1150 BC have been found in the wilderness at Timnah, not far from the route of the Israelite wanderings. 7. A stele, an inscribed tombstone like stone slab, from the Egyptian pharaoh Merenptah, circa 1209 BC, mentions that he had conquered the people of Israel in an invasion of Canaan. This would fit with an exodus from Egypt sometime before this and demonstrates that Israel was already settled as a people in Canaan. This archaeological evidence makes skepticism about the historicity of the biblical account of the Exodus unwarranted. This is not to deny that the story is told to make theological points. Much historical writings is motivated by the desire to teach lessons from the past. Nor does the archaeological evidence require one to believe that the book of Exodus gives a complete and full account of what happened. There are obviously many gaps and events that are passed over, but the evidence does make it unreasonable to challenge the central affirmation of Old Testament faith. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Chapter 20, verse 2. Okay, now we are getting to the key themes. The events and instructions narrated in the book of Exodus are explicitly framed as the Lord remembering his covenant promises to Abraham. The promises include land, numerous offspring, and blessing for both Abraham's descendants and the nations, which are rooted in the covenant relationship with the Lord. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you, and I will be their God. The covenant promises in Genesis were made with Abraham and reaffirmed with Isaac and Jacob. Exodus highlights the role that Moses fills as the covenant mediator through whom the Lord reveals his purposes to his people and sustains the covenant relationship. Each of these aspects will be described briefly in relation to key themes in Exodus. 1. Offspring. As was noted above, the Lord promised Abraham that he would have innumerable offspring, who would also be afflicted for 400 years in a foreign land and come out with great possessions. Through Joseph, the Lord brings 70 individuals into the land of Egypt, who became numerous, even amid affliction, and were brought out of Egypt as a large multitude. Exodus also focuses on how the people of Israel are shown to be Abraham's offspring, both in the faithful actions of some of its members, parentheses says the midwives fear God, not Pharaoh, and particularly by the fact that the Lord repeatedly refers to them as my people in his words to Israel and before Pharaoh. The Lord is indicating both to Pharaoh and to the people that although they have been enslaved in Egypt for a long time, it is his covenant promise to them as Abraham's offspring that truly governs their identity. 2. Land. The entrance into the land of Canaan is not realized within the events narrated in Exodus, but the promise of the land is held before Israel as a place of provision that is flowing with milk and honey, and also as a place they will inherit and where they will live as the Lord's people. The promise of the land is significant for what Israel's response in certain situations reveals about their understanding of both the Lord's presence and his promise to bring them to Canaan. When the people are hungry after coming out of Egypt and wish they were back in slavery by the meat pots, the contrast between where they are headed and what they long for in Egypt shows that they have not yet taken to heart what the Lord's deliverance is to signify for them. Their prospects in Canaan are declared to depend on their fidelity in serving the Lord alone, which the Israelites also have not taken fully to heart, as demonstrated by the incident of the golden calf before they ever set foot in Canaan. 3. Blessing. The Lord's promise to bless all nations through Abraham looks forward to how Israel's life is to meditate the presence of the Lord to the nations around them. They are to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Israel is to live before God in the world, obeying the covenant instructions that He will reveal to them. The events of the plagues and Exodus present the opportunity for people back in Egypt and the surrounding nations to join the Lord's people in response to what they have either experienced, in parentheses, thus Israel goes out a mixed multitude, or what they have heard. The recognition formula includes the expectation that the Egyptians will know that Israel's God is the true God. 4. Covenant mediator. A key theme of Exodus is that Moses is the one who is called by God to mediate between the Lord and His people. A key indicator of whether Israel will desire to live as the Lord's people is seen in how they respond to Moses as the one who speaks on the Lord's behalf. The story of Moses begins with his preservation at birth and in Midian, but is highlighted through the Lord's presence and speech in his call at the burning bush. And then in the fact that the Lord speaks to Moses alone in Egypt, calls Moses alone up to Mount Sinai, listens to Moses' intercession on behalf of the people, speaks with Moses face to face, and has Moses oversee the assembling of the tabernacle and the consecration of both it and the priest who will serve in it. 5. Covenant presence. The presence of the Lord is highlighted throughout the book of Exodus. He appears to Moses in the burning bush. He comes down on Mount Sinai in the sight of the people. He reveals himself to the leaders of Israel. He shows Moses his glory and declares his covenant character. Furthermore, a large part of the second half of the book focuses on the instructions for and assembling of the tabernacle, in which the Lord promises to dwell among His people. Just as the ground on which Moses stood at the burning bush was holy because of the Lord's presence, so it is also His presence among His people that will make them holy, and in light of the covenant breach with the golden calf. Exodus ends with the lingering question of just how a sinful people will live with a holy God in her midst, which is a question that the instruction recorded in Leviticus will begin to address. Okay. It goes on with the history of salvation summary and literary features, and then it does an outline. So I'm going to stop there, and I wondered, next week we will begin with chapter 1, and I want to tell you the question one more time. What was Solomon's other name? What was Solomon's other name? And I had a question. If any of you have an ESV Bible in large or giant print, then I was wondering if someone might be interested in trading for this study Bible. I have two of these. This one has someone's name on it, but I can easily put a little plaque on that for you or something pretty over that if you wanted that. I don't have any tabs in this one, but as far as I know, there's not any writing in this one. Oh, there's a little bit of highlighting I just saw as I flipped through right there, but very, very minimal. The other one that I have is the same Bible, only it's a different color. Doesn't have a name on the front. It has tabs that I've put in the side, but as you know with tabs, when you use them, sometimes they'll tear the pages, so some of them may be retaped in. I do not recall if there's any writing in that one or not. But if you're interested, I can get them both out and we can kind of do a video chat or something and let you see them. And anyway, just if you are, leave me a comment or send me an email down below. It is in the more description box for that email. Also, if you have any prayer requests, I am more than happy to pray with you. If you want to leave them for the group to pray for you, put them in the comments below. If you want for me to just pray privately with you, then please send me an email and I'll be glad to do that. I think that is everything that I needed to tell you. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. That would really help the channel out, and I will look forward to seeing each of you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye. Work in the light, rely on the Christ, left side of my life.